Well, thank you very much for doing this, and
Yeah, my pleasure.
congratulations first and foremost.
Thank
Um,
you.
let's just get started with the
Mm,
questions because I know that everyone's
sure.
very busy. But my first question is, when was the first time that you saw art as being a form of documentation?
Um, yeah, it's a tough question because it's really hard to pin down, um, given the fact that I grew up in Bahrain and wasn't really exposed to contemporary art. Um, at a young age, and so it was really when I guess when I went to university and began being exposed to art and design and architecture. I studied architecture for my undergraduate degree and then did an MFA um, later on. And so really it was much later in I guess like in life that I really began being exposed to art as documentation. But when I think back, I think really I've always considered archaeology and artifacts as a sort of documentation of art and culture and stories and that was something that I really was exposed to at a very young age. On field trips and school projects and things like that. And I think it's really carried on into my practice even today.
And then you kind of like touched upon it to like some extent, but obviously growing up in Bahrain,
Mm.
were there any artists from your country or the Middle East that you were exposed to, like at a young age? Or
I I mean, off the top of my head, not really. But I mean, I will say that I think the culture was always one that was very appreciative of art and art in all forms, through poetry and song, and as I mentioned with archaeology and the setup of the museums. I think I was exposed to that at a young age, but I wouldn't necessarily say that I really knew about artists coming from Bahrain. Although I'm beginning to see the wealth of artists and practices that are coming out of that place.
and then moving to your Rhode Island where you studied
Mhm.
architecture. How did you kind of like spend that time developing? Did you like experiment a lot, or was it kind of like you went there and you had this vision of kind of what you wanted to pursue?
It was extremely experimental, I would say. There was no kind of set idea or goal really in terms of the creation of one particular project or one aspect of my practice. But I would say that it allowed me a lot of freedom to explore things that I was interested in. And going even further than that, I think it allowed me to really reflect on the things that I was most interested in. Having, you know, getting away and having some distance from, home and where the environment that I was really used to made me reflect on the the kind of topics and issues that I had like held most dear. Um, and one of which being this project that I had already began, watering the distant, deserting the near. It was already a project that I began researching even prior to going to do my MFA at RISD. Um, and so that space and kind of that distance allowed greater experimentation and also greater amounts of resources available.
No, absolutely. And then kind of just before we get to the big piece,
Mm.
for those that haven't seen your work before, how would you describe it?
Um, at its core, I think my work, I mean, particularly the piece that was exhibited at the Louvre, but my practice in general really is about trying to tell stories or narratives that are either overlooked or just have not been expressed from a variety of perspectives and points of view. And so really trying to use research into personal and collective memory, archival material, and then also experiments and research into materials themselves and the poetics of material and meaning, to really create create works that try to convey that story in a sensorial way.
Yeah, it's a very good way of putting it. When you go with each project and you look at like all these different types of materials, whether they're artifacts or archival materials, is there a like set way that you go and approach a project, or is like each single one quite different?
I would say they are quite different. I think what they have in common probably is the kind of language that I use in making work or displaying work. And that language is really also based on my understanding of what like archaeological method is, and trying to understand the steps and the strategies that archaeologists, for example, take in trying to produce meaning and convey meaning, but then at the same time trying to break that tradition, trying to question ways in which I would be able to, as almost like an amateur archaeologist, try to make those strategies more personal, but also more related to this place. And really the choice of material, subject matter is driven by curiosity, and also is a result of research. So for example, with the work at the Louvre, which a big component of it is these sand fragments, these cast sand fragments that came out of a process of trying to learn how to cast glass and making molds for glass casting. So it was completely like a different trajectory that then informed and gave me an idea to adapt it into this project.
Do you see there being a relationship between being an archaeologist and an artist?
I think so. I think artists work in very different ways. I think my approach to researching a project, researching for a work that I'm interested in and a story I'm interested in, does have certain aspects that are common with maybe a more scientific or academic way of approaching things, but I'm equally interested in breaking those things and finding ways that are more informal or make more sense dependent on a certain subject or a project. And then with archaeology, I think, and artifacts, there is a sense of legitimacy that comes with seeing something on display at like a major museum, seeing something under glass, which gives it this preciousness and value. And I'm playing on those things to try to make these fictional artifacts into ones that can tell a story that people will believe and people will take note of. Yeah.
And then kind of getting on to the watering the distant, deserting the near. How did you approach this project initially? That's my first question.
Initially, it came out of a childhood memory. And it was just a memory that popped into my head one day. And I had been trying to really think of places that connected me to the landscape in Bahrain where I grew up. And this was one that popped up. But unlike the other memories, it was complicated because I had no documentation of ever visiting the spring, although I remembered it. And there was also no one who could confirm whether I had been there or not. And so this really kind of complicated, very murky memory was what initiated this whole process of trying to research this place. Firstly, to find out if I was remembering things correctly, but eventually turned into this huge project with so much with so much information and so many other people's memories involved, and that only made my memory worse because I then couldn't tell what was real and what was not. Yeah.
Did you have like any preconceived notion of what this project would become prior to like starting it?
Not really. And in fact, I mean, this project is almost 7 years old since I first began, and it's taken on many different iterations, both in material, content, and the work as it's shown at the Louvre is actually a collection of different parts of this research and different parts of this project. So there's an audio piece that plays in as you experience the installation, and that was one of the first iterations and kind of works that I'd created, and that was really trying to collect all these memories, personal and collective, to try to create some kind of timeline that described the drying of the spring. The sand works really came much later. And initially I had begun by making casts of the landscape. So physically on site, pouring plaster onto the landscape into frames and then lifting these up as sort of these records of this place. But the more research I did and the more experiments with material, new ways of conveying this story were revealed. And I think the culmination of that came when I began experimenting with sand, because it's a material that is extremely poetic within this context of, this landscape that was once full of water and vegetation that now is dry, and sand being this material that we associate with dryness and also associate with fragility. And this project really is trying to highlight the fragility of memory in relation to this place that doesn't exist anymore.
And then kind of like touching upon like the different methods that you ended up using, were there like any difficulties with like one, or like something that you did and then ended up not being able to use because it didn't work out?
I can't remember. Only because I think I do a lot of experimentation with components of this project, whether it's, there's a lot of archival material, for example, that I have saved in my studio, but has never been shown before. And I think it's probably because I haven't been able to find a way to bring that into the project, or to create a part of the work that where that fits, or where it can exist. And in some other projects that I've worked on, these kind of text-based or photography-based archival pieces of information, do end up becoming part of a text that I write, or a book that is associated with the project. But I can't really think of things that really didn't work. I mean, I also work with materials that are very hard to work with. So sand is very hard to control, and and I kind of have to accept that it's not always going to do what I want, but that the fragility of it and the difficulty in handling it, I guess, adds to the meaning within the work.
And then what do you hope people take from this work? Like, what is the meaning that you wish to convey?
Well, I mean, I know that this project has a very personal connection and relevance to me, and I know it does to a lot of people from Bahrain, but I think really the essence of it is contained within the title of the work, which, you know, watering the distant, deserting the near, was a phrase that was coined or attributed to the waters of the spring, because it was the largest spring in Bahrain, the biggest resource available, and so naturally people were in competition over this resource, and so this water was channeled very far away from its source, and due to overpopulation, poor farming practices, destabilization of the underground aquifer due to drilling for oil. These are all factors that really contributed to the decline of this spring. And this phrase really came to signify, things that you don't really appreciate until they're gone. And so I think that's really something that everyone I've spoken to about the work can relate to and find their own connections to places and things in their landscape and in their lives that are really important to recognize and important to document and record. And more and more recently, it's become kind of an example of how climate change has affected our landscapes, and in particular Bahrain, which was a very green landscape until the past 100 years or so. And you can see that decline on the ground and in like aerial imagery. And so, yeah, I'm also hoping that people begin to recognize the urgency of this matter through this work.
And then obviously congratulations on winning the prize. How does it feel being the first recipient of the Richard Mille Prize, and did you at all expect it?
Thank you. And yeah, it feels great. I mean, I've been really happy to see the support that I've had from my community, and also new connections with Richard Mille and the Louvre, and the arts ecosystem in general. I don't know. It's a hard question to say if I expect it, or a hard answer to give, because I think I did in a sense expect it, because I mean, I know how much work I've put into the project, and I know that it's developed over so many years, that it was really a moment where all the stars aligned more or less, because the open call and the theme of the exhibition was very much in line with things that I'm interested in my studio. And then this project too was one that ticked all of those boxes. And even more than that, I think there was an opportunity for me to engage with the museum, and the museum as the setting where people would get an exposure to, you know, an archaeological display, and then compare my approach to the one of the museum.
Mhm.
Yeah, and at the same time, I mean, I also know that, you know, all the other artists are really wonderful, and their work is really, really great. And so I really, at the moment, I had no idea, but in hindsight, I guess I can say that, yeah, I expected it a little bit.
And a lot of people are probably quite interested, but what are you planning on doing with the prize money?
I mean, really, it's probably just all going to go back into my studio. And yeah, trying to invest it back into the creation of more work and other projects that I'm interested in. And yeah, there's a few things that I want to be working on over the next year or two. So really, I hope it's going to go a long way.
And then kind of, you know, this piece was about like your home country. Do you feel kind of a pressure to some extent now to keep that as like a subject matter in your art?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I do find that there's a lot of there's a lot to research and a lot to mine in Bahrain, and especially with stories about that place. And I think that's one of the reasons why I keep going back to working on projects that relate to home. Specifically because we don't have, I think, a long history of documentation and recording narratives. And so I think it's really essential that these moments in time get recorded, and then also get presented in ways that are not like the official representation of history. But having said that, I mean, I think there's a lot of other projects that I have that don't relate to Bahrain, but do relate to the documentation of time and place, whether it's here in the UAE, or back in Bahrain, or within the region.
And then I read that you live in Abu Dhabi, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the city, and I guess like the country, is a good place that supports artists?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I've lived here for almost 13 years now. And I've really seen that the development of support happen. I think when I first moved here, it was hard to see or recognize a path that you can take as an artist, especially a young artist who, you know, wants to begin a career or wants to get educated in art, and that's really grown so much in my time here. And I think there's a really rich community, or rich communities of artists that live here and that are extremely generous, and have been very very instrumental in me forming my career and the work that I make today. And I only see that increasing. I mean, I think as time goes by, there's only going to be more artists and more opportunities, probably.
And how would you describe the art scene in the UAE?
I always get asked this question. I don't know. I think it's really hard to describe without leaving things out. I think the best way to describe it that I found is to describe my experience.
Yeah.
In how it exists, and particularly in Abu Dhabi, where I live and where I work, and I also work for a art program that is a fellowship for young emerging artists. And so we provide, a platform for artists artists who are looking to build a career and build a practice, and give them studio spaces and lectures and workshops, etc. And I was a part of that program 7 or so years ago. And so, what began kind of as, this initiative to try to find the gaps in the arts landscape that, artists, younger emerging artists could benefit from. It provided me with that level of support that I really needed at the time. And that's really what pushed me into wanting to pursue this as, a serious profession. And then from there, I guess the level of support really came from institutions that have a, I guess, or really want to support the emerging artist, and try to build, their practice so that there is longevity that exists in this space. And we're beginning to see that. And I think there are a lot of artists that are of my generation who are doing really amazing things. And I really hope that continues.
Absolutely. And I have a final question for you. And what are you hoping to achieve this year?
I have a couple of exhibitions I'm going to be a part of, coming up very soon. And yeah, a couple of new works that are in progress. So yeah, I'm really hoping that I get the time to work on those and develop them further. I think that's something that, with my type of practice, which involves a lot of research, really needs kind of a longer time period to develop. And so, most of the things I work on this year don't get finished this year. So yeah, the exhibitions I'm a part of in 2022 were really things that I'd worked on over the past couple of years. So yeah, to me, the most exciting part of making work is when I have a new project, and makes me want to drop all the other projects and just focus on one. But I know that I have to split my brain to really simultaneously work on a lot of things. But yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Those are all my questions. I don't think I've missed anything out, but I covered all ground. But thank you so much.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Really nice to talk to you.
Lovely to talk to you too. And I think that's it, right? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Have a really nice rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.